My advice is always, always, always negotiate your rate upwards if you can, because the worst thing that can happen is they say no. The best thing that can happen is you make more money. This can look anything from $50 more to $500 more.
This is Real Perspective, and I'm your host, Eli Yetter-Bowman. On this show, I interview various professional storytellers, often in the documentary space like myself, and we explore the craft of storytelling. Guests share their honest perspectives, from past mistakes to tips for succeeding and other genuine insights on how we can make a living creatively. This show includes no advertisers to keep things more authentic. If you want to support us, help us out, we do offer a variety of consulting services for filmmakers, storytellers, businesses, and other groups, on top of producing documentaries. Shoot us a message at etherealfilms.org if you want to learn more. Today's guest is Sofia, a freelance journalist who travels all over the world to report on unique science stories, often about ecology or neat critters. She's another colleague of mine from the NASEM Award cohort and became something of a second sister to me. She breaks down the art of the story pitch and how she makes it as a freelancer. What is freelance journalism as a profession? Just give us the basics. What does it mean to be a freelance journalist?
Mm-hmm. So being a freelance journalist means a couple of things. The freelance element here is that I don't work for a single publication, but I work for a variety of different publications, and my job is to pitch them ideas and then get those ideas in the paper. It's much less that editors are assigning me stories or that I'm on a staff role. I just write for a variety of different publications. And being a journalist means that my job is to tell stories to the lay public. So even though I cover science, and sometimes I cover it for scientific publications or publications that have an audience that knows about science, most of my work actually appears in national newspapers. So I cover science for a lay audience, a general public that might not necessarily know a lot about science or even necessarily care. But my job is to bring them stories that demystify science or bring them the latest updates on what's going on in the world.
That was beautiful. And I'll go further since we've already talked about what this is for the audience who maybe doesn't know. You said you're pitching stories constantly to these different media outlets with the hope that they'll sort of find interest and basically commission you to write it, in which case you'll then generate a piece with some negotiated rate. It's typically like based on the word count of the piece, and then you'll be paid money to create that piece for them based on that negotiated rate. Is that a pretty good explanation of the dynamic?
Yeah, that's perfect. And there's usually a misconception where a lot of my friends or even my parents think that I write the story before the editor approves it. But in reality, you're just pitching an idea at the beginning, and you're pitching them why you think the story matters. You don't ever send an editor a whole story, and you don't start working on the story until your editor has helped you shape it into what the publication would like to see.
Yeah, okay. And I want to put a pin in something, because you have actually combed through some of your own pitch emails and sort of run the numbers on success rates for pitches, which I think is really interesting context for the audience to hear what the actual rejection and sort of acceptance rate is, as well as this tactic that you have of also attempting to renegotiate pay when there is interest. I want to come back to that. I think that's really, really interesting. But I want to start first at, what was your path that led you to become a freelance journalist? Like where did this curiosity start, and how did you find yourself here?
Mm-hmm. So I actually always kind of knew I wanted to be a journalist. So I formally trained in journalism at university in a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. I didn't necessarily know I would end up being a freelance science journalist, but the freelancing kind of just happened because during the pandemic, I was working at a full-time staff position. I got laid off and sent back to Italy. So I had to kind of start from scratch during a time where the media industry was suffering a lot. And so I decided to become freelance. turns out it really fits with my personality and just kind of with my way of working. So that's kind of why I've stuck around as a freelance journalist, but I'm totally aware that this doesn't necessarily work for everybody and other people prefer more stability. And I ended up covering science again in kind of a serendipitous manner. I knew I wanted to be a reporter and I knew I wanted to be a journalist, bringing the lay public stories that matter. And currently, stories about the biodiversity crisis and the environment and climate change are some of the biggest topics that we're dealing with. So I just kind of ended up on the science and environment beat. I didn't have any formal training in anything scientific.
Can we go back actually? Because this is really curious to me. You said it with almost like absolute fortitude, like you were born and it was like, I will be a journalist. But like, what do you know? Was there a specific catalyst for this? Like, did you like watch a bunch of news or like you read a bunch of articles as a kid that you were like, or had someone in your life, maybe like a family member who followed the same career path and you're like, wow, they are so cool. That's going to be me. Like, why? I'm just so curious. Like, why a journalist?
I actually have no clue. So I know just since I was a kid, I've been going around telling people I was going to be a journalist. And my mom tells stories of me being like 4 and going around with a notebook and pretending to interview people. So there was something instilled, maybe from a really young age, that I just haven't really been able to pin down. It's kind of obnoxious though, because I realize a lot of people struggle a lot to find out what like their calling is or what they want to do with life. And I just kind of, I didn't even have to particularly try it. Just kind of knew that I wanted to do this. There's definitely an element of, I think journalism is such a beautiful profession just because you're learning every day. Yep. And I just clearly really liked learning stuff. So I think that's what it taps into from an early age. But again, I don't know. I just kind of took a shortcut in life and like already knew what I wanted to do without necessarily having to try very hard, which is kind of obnoxious.
Honestly, so this is interesting. I feel like there was a great episode of the Hidden Brain podcast recently, which one of the guests, a psychologist on the show, identified that I think from age 3 and before that, we tend to not form solid memories, but beyond that, we form solid memories. And so there tend to be age or like huge gaps in our fundamental memory from age 3 and before that, unless there's a specific trauma event. So like whatever your motive for journalism is in that unreachable age range. Wow, we almost need like a full investigation into like what happened to you when you were 1, 2, or 3. That, anyways,
yeah, I don't know.
A tale for another day. You've talked a little bit about, you know, like what the nuts and bolts of like a freelance journalist is in terms of like a job. Can you describe what does the world of journalism look like now? But first, what did the world of journalism look like when you first, you know, finished university and started working in the States?
I'm relatively junior here, so I don't actually know whether there's been a big change. Or I think I came into the same kind of time, like I came into the job at the same time period that we still are in right now. So there's definitely a big sense of loss of trust in the media, loss of trust in science, budget cuts. A lot of publications I used to work for have folded over the past 5 years. But yeah, I'm relatively junior in my career. I'm entering, I think, my 6th year as a professional journalist. So we've just kind of been constantly going through this moment of change where I know a lot of publications are trying to find new ways to become more sustainable because the current models aren't necessarily really working that well. So yeah, definitely a hard time for the current.
Yeah. I do feel I have some friends who've been maybe a little bit more senior in their tenure in the field of journalism, and I think it's a troubling time for a lot of different forms of reporting and storytelling, which is like kind of one of the main motivations for this podcast is to like allow different types of voices, different types of professional storytellers. I think just share in some ways how we're all trying to like test different models of sustainability in our jobs. I don't know I'm curious to what extent, if any, you're thinking for yourself about what to shift. Because actually just this past week, I had a different guest on the show who's a visual artist. I promise there's relevance of this aside. Heather, she's a visual artist from Asheville, North Carolina, which of course is where Hurricane Helene just came and sort of devastated, is one of the biggest natural disasters in the history of the state. And this is a visual artist, so she produces like big pieces of work that take a long time and then sells a lot of prints. And most of her income actually comes from those prints. So it's just like copies of her work. And she was just talking a lot about, because she had sort of big presence on social media at one point, which I think a lot of creatives and storytellers think, well, can I leverage my having my own audience and my own reach as sort of a platform? And explained a very interesting up and down story of like, she had a pretty big following, but then the platform fell apart. This was Twitter, formerly Twitter, where she had a big following, and then it became like unsustainable. And so her new model, or her recommendation for people who are involved in her space of visual arts, is like being closer to her community, like physically, geographically. So she has like a whole bunch of people where she lives who like support her work and buy her work because they know her and care about her. And that's sort of like her message and takeaway as a professional visual artist who's been doing it a long time. I recognize visual artist who produces galleries and freelance journalist who writes stories pretty far on the ends of storytelling spectrums, but I just bring this up because I think it's interesting to see different perspectives of how like the change of the internet, right? Like it's ultimately the role of technology and the internet changing the way that people consume media, consume stories, because those are the same pressures that I believe have limited journalism in the way that it currently is, right? It's like a newspaper doesn't matter as much if there's a million different sources of news information these days, or at least its currency may not matter. Of course, there's still relevance to local news, perhaps even a lot more relevance than there ever has needed to be. Some folks who are more involved in written, printed works, digital writing, like yourself, have shifted into like this newsletter, Substack sort of approach instead of just relying on writing stories to hopefully sell to a publication of, well, is there a reason that my stories sell? It's because I'm good at what I do. Like you're good at what you do, right? And so I'm curious if this is something that you're ever thinking about of like, well, maybe I should also experiment and collaborate, or like, yeah, experiment with diversifying the way in which you earn a living for what you do. Okay, that was like a whole aside. You talk now, please.
Yeah, so personally, I'm not particularly interested in trying to find new ways to reach my readership. Mainly also just because of what I was saying earlier, where I'm still relatively junior in the field. And so I think that my skills and my service is best you put to use if I serve publications that already have readers. And so I can provide good quality, thorough, and thoughtful journalism for publications who already have a community. One way that I definitely am trying to experiment more, two ways. So, two things.
Yeah.
One, I say this, but at the same time, I am about to finally open social media channels this year.
Whoa.
I'm not on social media at all as a journalist and as a person, as a personal person either. But this year I'm going to get social media channels. Probably I'm looking into Instagram for Reels and TikTok, even though I know TikTok is going through a bit of a moment right now in the US. But so this year I'm definitely looking into that, mainly to grow a community, I guess, or just kind of show people that I also exist on social media, but I'm quite hesitant to do that, and it's a big time and effort. So we'll see about that. I'm testing it out, so I'll admit that I'm testing out this new method, but that's as far as I'm going to go. I'm not particularly interested in having a newsletter or a Substack or something like that. But one way that I am trying to improve the sustainability of my work as a journalist, working as a freelancer for legacy media outlets, is, and I need to premise this with the issue. So the issue is, as a freelancer, it's really hard to work on long, thoughtful, thorough, meaningful stories, because if those stories take more time than expected, that it's just not worth the return on investment. So you spend a lot of time and money and effort researching something, and maybe the story falls through, and because you're not on staff, that time has not been paid for or accounted for. That's the traditional freelance method. And right now, I will be very honest, it does often undermine the quality of journalism that I can do, because maybe I would like to have the freedom to spend a whole month on a story,
Right.
but because rates are what they are, I need to think about how much time am I investing and how much money am I gonna get paid for this story. One way that I'm going to improve this year, and that I'm looking into making this more sustainable so I can pursue long-term stories that are more thoughtful and more thorough, is not just relying on the rate that I'm going to get paid for the words that I'm going to write, but trying to rely on grants from philanthropic funds or third-party donors that do invest money in making sure journalists can do reporting that's a little bit longer, a little bit more thorough, a little bit more long-winded maybe, but it does provide a good story. So I need to get better at doing that. I know there are a lot of brilliant, talented freelance journalists out there who have already figured out how to make sure that grants are sustaining their reporting.
Yeah.
And also, I am not one to have big like hot takes on the future of media, but I do definitely think we're in the time of philanthropic funds and donors needing to step up and put their money where their mouth is and kind of funding valuable journalism. I think that's going to be how we continue to bring good, thorough journalism to our readers, because the publications themselves just don't pay that much
All
anymore.
of the professional work that I've done in documentary the past 7 years, if it was funded, well, I figured out some ways to make money in different avenues, but primarily my income and my ability to produce works have come from direct, you could call them grants, sometimes they're donations, sometimes it's an individual, sometimes it's a foundation. I think given how talented you already are as just like a person who pitches, right? And also how, I mean, it seems like you have to do it literally all the time. I mean, I looked at some of the numbers that you shared. I already think you're in a really strong suited position to do it. If anything, it wouldn't really change your flow that much in terms of what you are doing, but perhaps there's a much better return on investment, right? If you send 100 pitches, but instead of asking, can I write a story and maybe be compensated a few $100s, to send the same number of pitches, maybe there's a lower chance of success, but you send the same number of pitches, but you're asking for like, you know, several $1,000s to work on a story. But to have exactly like you said, like more time to it. I honestly think that is worth exploring from you, because that's precisely the avenue that I took in documentary. Of course, it's going to be a little bit different, but the fact that you already have a body of work that's demonstrated that you can get stories into major outlets, like that's really strong leverage, dude. You know, so I mean, I'm happy to. If that's an interest, I would bring that up. I actually think that that's a really easy and natural expansion to what you're already doing. That's really not requiring much more work, if any. It's just pitching, rather than pitching the outlet, you're pitching, you know, like, do I want to do a story in biodiversity? Because there's so many biodiversity foundations that there's a lot of money being sunk into. And so I think that you are in actually a really good position. I mean, I do so much work, of course, in like the environmental space. I know for a fact that there's a lot of philanthropic money being poured into biodiversity, right? Or like the threats of climate change to hamper biodiversity.
There is always obviously like an ethical implication issue here of like, if you're getting money from third parties, then are you still really like an ethical journalist who is holding power to account and kind of detached and independent? So there still is, yeah, there's an issue moving forward of how we can continue to ask big philanthropists to fund better journalism, b, make sure that we remain independent while taking money from them. So yeah, definitely something that I'm looking
I'm
into
actually
this
really
year.
glad that you brought that up, because that's like the cornerstone of how I have all of my like philanthropic arrangements or agreements. Like I have based within what I believe is still like an ethical model of, okay, if I'm asking this person to financially support whatever it is that I'm doing, one, I have to have already been interested in that in the first place. And two, at least for me, I am never yielding any creative control, meaning that like they
Yeah.
see that this is good. You know, they might have interests that are different from mine, but in this case, this project that we're pitching, we're mutually aligned. Because also, I mean, I think that's right. I think it's really like, it's cool that you're already thinking about that, but that you're considering those like ethical risks, so to speak, right? Or like of damaging your own credibility or your own authenticity or just like your ability to hold powers to account. There's something to be said also about how in the socioeconomic structure that we live in, I mean, even accepting money from an outlet to some extent, it's like, are you tacitly agreeing with everything that they're saying? Surely you're not, right? There's tons of people that, right? And so, you know, not to throw it all out and say like there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, but there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. So keeping on track. This is good. I love talking about diversifying income and sustainability of, you know, all my friends and all their awesome creative endeavors. I want to hit on major challenges first, like a real failure experience, specifically to like give a learned lesson to listeners. Like give us an example of like when you made a major mistake in your career as a journalist and what you learned from it.
So the only one that's coming to mind right now is a really specific example. I did a story about microplastics for a publication I regularly worked for. They assigned me the story. And they had assigned me a study that it was going to start from. And they were like, using this study, then I want you to cover A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That one study was problematic in some very minor ways, but in ways that had been used to kind of, we used some of those findings for a splashy headline. So the story was I think it's you inhale a credit card worth of microplastics every week or something like that.
Fact checking.
So that study was all over the news. That study was everywhere. And so they wanted me to cover that study. And because it came from my editor, I just kind of went with it and stuff. Worked on the piece, interviewed the people who were involved, interviewed external experts to kind of cover the rest of the topics that we were going to cover. So it wasn't just going to be about microplastics. It was also then going to cover, it wasn't just going to be about inhaling microplastics. It was also just going to then cover kind of the social issues and like who's most affected and why. So we had a wide variety of people in there discussing things. And so the initial kind of like you breathe in a credit card worth of microplastic was just like a segue to then talk about the much bigger issue. And I just didn't do enough fact checking on that or on the actual claim of the credit card. And I didn't ask external experts to run through the numbers again. I had just relied on the researchers who did the calculations in the first place. When the story published, I received emails specifically from the researchers who had produced the data that had then been used in this other study to say it's a credit card worth of plastics. And so they reached out to me and said, listen, this isn't a major mistake, but the issue is their calculations are wrong. They had never reached out to us. We collected the data initially, and they had never reached out to us about this other paper that they were writing using our data. And so it's just the claim of like the credit card is a fun, splashy claim, but it's just not accurate. And so this is obviously the researchers were more upset at the other scientists than they were at me, because they were just saying the other scientists should have done a better job of doing their calculations and reaching out to us in the first place, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. But yeah, that was a big failure on my end, because I should have looked at where the primary data came from, and I should have reached out to the primary researchers who had worked on that first primary data collection. But instead, I just went off of kind of the secondary study, which was still like a study published in a legit journal and everything. But yeah, I should have done more fact checking on that end. Again, the story wasn't just a news story about that paper. It was about a lot of bigger implications. But the fact that I had missed that factual issue there kind of really undermined the credibility of the story. And I had to we ran corrections immediately
Sure.
as soon as I figured out how to word the correction and solve it and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But because the story got picked up by a lot of other outlets as
Yep.
well, the headline wasn't changed everywhere. So there still probably are stories out there saying that we breathe in a credit card worth of microplastics. And it's not a credit card, it's like 9/10 of a credit card, but it's still not a credit card. So it just doesn't, the analogy doesn't make sense.
So yeah, I found both. I did fact checking during this because I think this is a really interesting example. Wow, that article has so many views now for a scientific publication. Lifetime accumulation of microplastic in children and adults in 2021 appears to be the original study, which like even from the abstract, it's not straightforward or simple to just like get a direct like amount per day from here. Like it seems like it's micrometers, nanograms. It's like certain numbers of nanograms or particles per day. So it's not even in like units that the average person would understand. The follow-up fact-checking paper is November 2022. Ingested microplastics. Do humans eat one credit card per week? And they like tear it apart. And they're like, the calculation of a credit card here, like per week, contains several errors. So it's really, really interesting. I think it raises a lot of interesting points. Also to your kind of the earlier discussion around like by not being financially compensated in a way that allows you to spend longer periods of time to really give yourself fully to a story. I think it's much more like it's normal and it should be expected almost to have like these perhaps minor or innocent oversights in reporting and science journalism in the first place, right? Because this is not all obvious.
On that note, so when I talk about not having a lot of time to spend on stories in a way that is meaningful, I mean more when it comes to on-the-ground reporting.
Sure.
So because on-the-ground reporting of going to visit the communities that are affected in first person by these studies, that's what's time-consuming and it's a big financial ask that freelance journalism struggles to support. Mm-hmm. When it comes to doing news stories, it is my duty as a journalist to be accurate, factual, and speedy. And this was a news story, so that was completely just my fault and not necessarily up to issues in the system. Like it's my job as a news reporter to jump on the news quickly and do an accurate and factual job of reporting it for our readers. So that's just my pitfall. Where I talk about the fact that it's hard as a freelancer to invest a lot of time and energy in longer stories that might not pan out. I'm talking about stories that are person-centered and that require local reporting or traveling or going on the ground or spending time with sources in a way that's meaningful to a narrative story. Right. And that's really hard to do as a freelancer because maybe I'll spend a week with a family trying to report on a story and the story falls through and then I haven't been compensated for that. But for news, part of the job as a news journalist is to be fast and accurate at the same time. So in that case scenario, it was my failure because I wasn't both of the things.
I appreciate this distinction. Also, I like the differentiation between the news story and the narrative-based story. Then there still remains like, I guess the other like specific issue to like science reporting. And this is true. It's really true in the documentary space or like long form stories, right? Where there is a lot of time spent. It's something that comes up a lot in my community in the Southern doc field, which is like, it feels like there are not enough incentives for really accurate, like really factually sound and like scientifically certain or assured stories and writing or producing of works. And what I mean by that is like, in some ways, if the currency is like, well, what's going to get a lot of clicks? What's going to get a lot of people interested? What's going to be exciting? And this has been known for probably the history of journalism, right? Is like something flashy, something that stands out, something that's bold, something maybe that's an overstatement or a hyperbole or a simplification can often be the thing that is sort of clickbait, right? And if the currency of a storyteller or journalist is like engagement to a certain extent, like that's problematic, right? Because it's almost like we're rewarded in some cases to at least somewhat be clickbaity, to at least somewhat be like, I've heard it called like alarmist versus conservative. So I certainly feel those pressures a lot in the documentary space. In fact, I think most the documentary filmmakers that I know tend to really put a low value on like scientific accuracy, or like most stories are just like most documentary filmmakers don't want to touch science. If they do, they want it to be easy, nice things like ecology or just like celebrating an animal, but they don't want to get into the nitty gritty of like, oh crap, we got to talk to like a doctor and like all these different like scientific experts and then like try to understand them because there aren't reward structures for it. And oftentimes it's easier to just like not spend all that extra time because your focus is the narrative and getting people interested. So how do you balance these pressures as a science journalist of like, I want you brought this up as an example of failure, right? So like you learned something from this. We're learning something from this. But to that extent, how do you balance the opposite of like, you don't want to like be so cautious, overly cautious in what you're saying that it's like, well, that's a boring headline.
Mm-hmm. So several layers to this answer. On one side, obviously, this is something that we all think of and struggle with every day and that we think a lot about and we don't have an easy answer to. So unfortunately, I don't think I've come up with a solution yet. On the other hand, I am a journalist who works for big lay public publications or general audience publications. So I don't ever really think, will readers be interested in this? I immediately think, will my editor think readers will be interested in this? So technically, I'm already outsourcing that. So I don't necessarily fight for clicks or fight for audience or fight for engagement. I'm much more focused on working on a story that I like or that I think is important or that I think has a big implication or a bigger picture to talk about. And then it's my editor's job and it's the publications audience team's job to understand, does this align with what our readers need to hear or want to hear? So on my end, there's a little bit less of that compared to, for example, the thinking that you have to do where as an independent documentary maker, you're the first and last person in charge of this. On that note, I'm currently having a little bit of a crisis of faith myself because, as I said, I started off as a general public journalist and was just interested in doing journalism. I didn't care what about. Then in the past couple of years, I've really specialized in the science world and I've started working with a lot more scientifically angled publications. So even if they're for the general public, they're more sciencey, like New Scientist or Scientific American, and other publications that are specifically for the scientific world. So like Science News. And yeah, I think I'm currently also kind of thinking more about this and worrying about whether I'm just kind of preaching to the choir and talking to the same people and writing for people who already know about the topics that we're writing for. So let's say I started off as a broad general audience reporter. I've specialized more in somebody who reports for other scientists as well. But in the upcoming years, I want to go back to doing more work for the general audience. Just because I think it fits with my mission and my vocation more of bringing news to the public that is accessible to everybody and freedom of information and access to information for the public. And so this was a long-winded answer to say, in light of this change that I'm trying to implement, because I think it's more aligned with the kind of journalism that I wanted to do in the first place, I'm starting to actually be a little bit more okay with simplifying some really hardcore stuff, because there's no point in hitting readers with super complicated, really hard to understand stuff if they're not going to engage with it. I understand much more the need to compromise so that readers actually do consume the material. And that's also why this year I have finally bitten the bullet and decided that I will join social media as a journalist, because that's what my younger brother gets his news from. That's what my parents get their news from. And they're both highly educated people. So clearly, while before I just didn't want to join those conversations, now I realize that if that's where the conversations are being had, then it is my job as a public information authority and as a journalist who does stuff for the public to join those conversations in a way that's helpful. So yes, all of this to say, I used to be a lot more conservative and hardcore, and now I am moving more towards, listen, like if we want people to be even remotely interested in what we have to say, we have to be keeping that in mind at all times. I'm very worried about preaching to the choir and just writing for people who already care about those topics. So yeah, that's a personal shift and a personal reflection that I'm going through at the moment right now.
There's so many great like elements that you touched on. Like you've really brought up again my main motivation for like creating this podcast, which will hopefully be a continued like active resource that's morphing and having more just like truthful dialogues around like how landscape is changing, the way that people consume their media, their stories. It is constantly changing, and it affects all of us in our professions of storytelling, right? Because it's like, cool, dude, I write books all the time, but like, all right, well, if nobody's like really reading books anymore, is that the best way to reach your audience, or like should we adapt with the times? Right? I mean, that was exactly why Ben made the shift that he did from like conducting science to talking about it on frickin' TikTok or this, that, and the other. So I think that that's really interesting. And I think we're definitely like kindred spirits in the way of like wanting to make sure that we're like being practical of like, how do people actually, if I'm trying to tell people great stuff, how do they actually hear it? Like where do people actually hear it, and how do I make it in a way that they want to hear it? Right? Like this is exactly what you're saying around like, don't write a super dense thing, right? Like make something that's actually going to keep people interested and engaged, and hopefully get the thing across that you're trying to get across as the author of that story. It's the only reason that I do any of the documentary work that I do, because I was way into the weeds of science and I was like, oh shit, like I'm not talking in a way that people can understand. I'm not getting my point across. How do people actually want to consume this information? How can I reach them, and how can I like hopefully create the change that I want? And so I just do it in a really weird way, which I'm now like starting to call interactive documentary, because it is something unique, you know? Like I think that in this social media dominated age in which we are flooded all the time with way too much stuff, specifically in the digital form, and everything's just noise, right? Like literally there's a million emails, there's 1,000 news articles, there's all the social media that you're considering going into that I caution you on. I mean, it has some merits, but then I mean, I'm not going to lie, there's a reason I'm not personally on social media. I have found that just like, while all this is happening, there's a real desire and a yearning for fun, sometimes people to go back to basics and just like share space with one another, right? Just like sit in a room and talk to each other. This is like the form of dialogue and engagement and like trying to touch people that I find to be very valuable as a person very passionate about some things and trying to get people to do stuff, which is hard. But I'll get off my soapbox. I think this is great. I think it's awesome that you're being open-minded and shifting. And I guess like I'm really curious to see what you feel about social media, dude. It'll be an interesting experiment.
So just to clarify, I am very much still treating this just as a job and not at all as like a personal thing that I'm doing. So I'm going to be opening social media channels for Sofia Qualia, the journalist who covers biodiversity. And I've scripted a lot of material and recorded it already, and I'm just going to be editing it and posting it in the same way that I would if I was working for a publication and doing stuff for them. So that's my method for going into this in a way that feels still professional and less putting myself out there in ways that don't serve the purpose of journalism, if that makes sense. Like if I was filming content personally every day and coming up with stories every day and writing and like thinking about things for social media only, I feel like that would be different. But yeah, this is just to clarify that. So I'm going to be doing videos about stories that I've reported. So basically, I'm just seeing it as an extension of the journalism I'm already doing for big
That's and
legacy
see, I think
media.
that's really, this is why you're so savvy. Is like that's great because you're not creating too much extra work. You're creating very specific boundaries around the use, and it's really just to develop further what you're already doing. But again, like you said, like if this is where people are getting a lot of their like news or like staying up to date with things, like that's smart. No, that's really smart.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring them the news that I'm already doing for others
That's
anyways,
it.
just
That's it.
in that way.
Really quick, we're doing so much better on time, even though this is the first time we've recorded, and we definitely didn't do this entire episode already and had to fix everything. That didn't happen. It did actually happen. I want you to share practical tips of success, and I want this to be actually more universally around what you have learned in your pitching. I think that is something that touches a lot of different professions, like the art of a pitch, the art of like making these arrangements. If you can, I would love for you to go into some of the figures and some of the details of like your success in the past year, some of the data on that. So this is from your experience as a freelance journalist pitching editors to produce stories. Start there, and then if there's some universal themes that you've learned of like, this is what's successful in a pitch, this is the main thing. I know you're going to say like nut graph and stuff like that people don't know what it is unless they're journalists, and that's cool, but also just like to keep in the bounds of our audience. And if you say anything that needs defining, I'll try to like bring it up. But I think you're great at this, and I would love for you to talk about like, how do you make a good pitch? What does the process look like? How do you do your pitches, and what's the success rate?
Mm-hmm. Perfect. I'm going to give you the full rundown. So this year, I actually finally put the work in I said I was going to put in, and I went through all of my emails and all of my interactions with editors to calculate exactly how many times I pitched, how many stories I got assigned from the pitches, and what my success rate was. So I'm going to run you work through that. Basically, in 2024, we're just going to go off my last year. So in 2024, I ended up writing 26 pieces of news, 27 longer news analysis pieces, one feature that's lengthy and narrative, and 12 explainer pieces. Out of those stories, 39 were stories that I pitched, and 27 were stories that I got assigned by editors. There's some confounding data in here because I work on a long-term project, so with an editor. So there's, let's say, 10 to 15 of those were part of this bigger project. So usually assignments are a lot less common. That said, that is in no way telling of how many times I actually pitched stories. So in 2024, I pitched 178 times, which means that only 21.9% of those ended up being stories. 19.1% of those emails didn't get answers at all. And 59% of those stories got answers that were somewhere along the lines of thanks, but no. There are several different reasons this might be. Some publications run out of budget, aren't interested in a particular story, are too busy to cover something in that moment of time. The story was too preliminary or wasn't time sensitive enough. Like there's various different reasons publications turn down stories. It's almost never about why, like it's almost never about the story being just an awful story. And there is a learning curve here on finding a balance between when it's not the right publication and so you just need to pitch somebody else, and when it's just not the right story and you should just drop the story. Admittedly, I'm not that good at letting go of stories yet, but I'm getting better every year. One thing about the data that I just shared of the pitching 178 times, this isn't necessarily pitching 178 different stories. This is just how many times I went to publications with stories. So, for example, this year I pitched a story about vampire squids to 4 different publications, and none of them wanted it. And so after 4 times of pitching it, I killed the story. Others ended up landing after a long time. So I pitched, for example, a story about brood parasites as a news piece 4 times, but then I was about to let it go, but I still wanted to work on it. And I sat on it for a couple months, and then somebody ended up taking it as a longer enterprise piece instead at my 5th pitch. So there's a lot of variation here in this data. In collecting this data, I also kind of just screenshotted some of the no's I often get, because you get a lot of no's when you're pitching, especially if you're pitching news publications, so on a quick turnaround. And mostly it's always, sorry, but it's a no. This idea is fun, but it's a little bit too speculative. Or I'm afraid we're already covering something similar. Or we did a similar story 2 months ago and just can't justify revisiting the same subject again. Or I'm at capacity at the moment and unable to take this. Or this finding is a bit too niche for our audience, but maybe another audience will like it better. And then mostly it's just, we'll pass on this, thanks. But that's kind of what the no's look like. And so I'll admit that when I first went into this exercise looking to calculate my rate, and last time we spoke, my success rate, I thought I would have had a 50% success rate. So I was under the impression that 50% of the stories I pitch get taken and get assigned. But actually, it's less than half of that. So that was kind of really humbling data. So the premise to this is that you need to kind of have boiled down that your pitching process works. And so you need to make sure that you're making it as easy as possible for the editor to understand whether this is a story that's a good fit for them or not. And that usually involves more or less always the same formula of providing editors with a top line of kind of what is the story about. And usually in journalism for news, especially, that looks like providing them with a headline. So how are you envisioning the headline for the story? And then there's an element of kind of explaining the bigger picture implications. So that's also really important part of a formula of, I think, what makes pitches work. And it's just kind of like, not just why is this cool or special now, and why should we be telling the story now, but also what's the bigger picture at play here? Does it say something about evolution? Does it say something about health? Does it say something about how the universe functions or our future? And then the third thing that I think is really important in all pitches and is way too often overlooked, and I tell a lot of my mentees that this is just an easy win, is editors. Editors are just like managers, and your job as a journalist is to also kind of be a good employee. And one easy way to do that is give your editors a very clear explanation of how you envision the story and what your current tools are to tell that story. And that can look like something as simple as the final 2 sentences of the email involve saying, I'm envisioning writing this many words. I'm envisioning this story looking like this other story that you worked on because A, B, C, D, and so it's similar. C, I have access to these people. I've already spoken to these other people, and this is what I plan on doing. And this is just some practical logistic stuff that isn't necessary for your story to sell, because what's important here is that you have a special story and an important story that is important to the publication's readers. But you're just helping the editor not have to do any guesswork, and you're telling them what you already have. And it's just kind of an operational thing that I think is really helpful. I know editors find it helpful. It helps solidify what the pitch looks like. And it also helps kind of, again, remember that editors are just like managers, and your job is to kind of report back to your manager with some helpful factual information that can be solid
You're
in
just so
problem
thorough.
solving.
Is it okay if we put some of these graphs or any of these like great tables or data that you've made in show notes?
I'll share this whole presentation, and I'm happy for you to take stuff from it as you wish. Full disclosure, I am currently doing this presentation as my mentoring project. So I mentor a couple of younger journalists, and so I made this for them with them in mind of like answering some questions that they had. But I am also working towards bringing this on tour for entire classes. So I'm in talks with universities to kind of host me as a speaker to bring this to some of their younger students and journalists younger
Yeah.
students who want to be journalists. Looking ahead, I am thinking about ways that I can monetize this. So I know that a lot of people sell courses online and do one-on-one coaching
Hmm.
online. I don't think that's a bit of me just yet, but I do have this really thorough 50 slide presentation with a bunch of data that's, I think, just really valuable. And so I am looking for ways to, how can this be helpful to people? And at the same time, how can I be fairly compensated for the work I put into creating this and
Absolutely.
sharing these
Because I've
resources?
definitely given quite a few like college lectures where I'm paid, or like I've given trainings and stuff where I'm giving presentations like this. I think you have a really good wealth of information, and that is also like there's a lot of contemporary value for like aspiring journalists, journalism students that I can think of. That is one of the important avenues of monetizing our work. Although internally, there's always this challenge and struggle that I feel in the creative space of like, don't just fall into like that multi-level marketing model where it's like,
Yeah,
well,
I
I
don't
did
want to
this
be
for
one of those
3 years.
people.
I did this
Yeah.
for 3 years, and now I've consulted in it instead for 50 years because it's far more lucrative to tell other people how to do it than to actually make a living doing that. We just,
Yeah.
we've already cleared our conscience because we at least said it. We spoke it into we're not hiding it. It is what it is. That's sort of what academia is if you really break it down. Just going to put that out there. I would argue that some graduate programs are just straight up scams. Okay, moving right along. So you've given a lot of great details about your own pitch process. You've shared the numbers of success versus failure, which is super helpful. In terms of just universally, so many different of us storytellers have to pitch things. Really, arguably, every person is always having to pitch in some point in their lives, even if it's just like pitching to their loved one which movie to watch tonight, right? And so it's universal value. What do you think are like the fundamentals of a great pitch? As pithy and as insightful and as sagacious as you are, Sophia, let's hear it. What makes a good pitch? How do you get someone to get what you're putting down?
Yeah, so I think this just echoes what I was saying about what makes a good pitch email for a news story for an editor. I think those are universal values. So why now? Why is this important right now? Why should I care right now? Why is this important on a bigger picture? So what's the big story here behind what you're telling me? What's the big implication? How does it matter to a large quantity or amount of people? And then the third pointer is, how do I get this done? So how am I going to get this done? How am I going to deliver on this project that I want to pitch you? I think those are my three kind of cardinal rules for what makes a good pitch. That said, and we've talked about this before, this is what makes a good pitch if you want somebody to care about a story in a universal way. But then I also think there's a reflection to be had on, should we always be telling stories that have bigger, larger implications for large amounts of people? Or is there a lot of value in telling stories that matter just to a couple people, maybe just to one person? And when is the time to tell those stories or pitch those stories? So, yeah, sorry, I answered with the question, but those are my three main rules. That said, there's a caveat of, yeah, some stories need to be meaningful now. Some stories need to be meaningful for a large implication. Um, do all stories have to? I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, you're in the door, and what do you do? An editor has said, I like the story, and you.
Yeah. So there's right after the editor says, I like the story, they usually tell you, we would like this many words for the story, and this is what we're going to pay you for it. Most publications, national publications for a lay audience, have a rate per word. So they pay you per word that they assign. So let's say the story is 1,000 words, you're going to get $1,000. For most of those publications, the rate is fixed and you have very little wiggle room on that. But always, always ask if there's wiggle room in the budget. Other publications have fixed rates for stories. So they'll say, we want a story that's 1,000 to 1,500 words, and we'll pay this flat fee of £660. those flat fee publications are usually ones that are paying less than per word publications just because of how the math works out. And those are also, though, the publications that you have more leeway in negotiating your rate, in my experience. So in my presentation that I put together for some of my students, while I was going through all of my emails to figure out how many times editors took my pitches, I also went through all of my emails to figure out how many times I asked for more money and how many times it actually worked. Again, this data has a lot of confounding factors here because most of these are publications I maybe already work with or editors who I already work with. So in some cases, I don't bother asking for more money anymore because I know they just don't have the budget. Or in other cases, I have more leeway in asking for more money because I've always worked for them already and they know that I'm solid in providing good work. That said, my advice is always, always, always negotiate your rate upwards if you can, because the worst thing that can happen is they say no. The best thing that can happen is you make more money. This can look anything from $50 more to $500 more, but you always want to ask if there's more budget. And publications usually have more budget than what they allocate for stories just because they're trying to keep themselves some wiggle room and some leeway. So in 2024, I asked just 13 times. I thought I had asked more times, honestly. Again, this is kind of a confounding factor here is that some of these editors I already work with, and maybe I asked them in 2023 and they told me they didn't have budget or something like that. That said, I asked 13 times in 2024. I got a no 38.5% of the time, and I got a yes 61.5% of the times. Yeah, more than 50% of the times they said, okay, we'll give you more money. And again, sometimes that looks like $50 extra, sometimes that looks like $500 extra. The exact sentence I use is always, is there any wiggle room on the budget for the story? Yeah, or any chance we have wiggle room to get to X. So I say the rate that I want. And yeah, this worked 60% of the times. So it's worth asking. Worst case scenario, they just say no and they just don't have money. And they're not going to be offended that you asked for more money. They understand that this is your job and you're trying to negotiate your rates. The reason they'll say no is just because they don't have the budget to cover that cost for you.
I'm going to ask the hard-hitting question, which is probably just a simple answer. Has anyone ever freaked out when you ask that? Have you ever had like a weird response or like a, you know what, forget it?
No, not at all. If anything, I've recently had a really lovely response of somebody saying, I totally understand how important this story is. I totally understand how much work you've put into this. Personally, we just cannot offer more than this. We don't pay any other writers this much. This is just as far as we can go. And I totally understand if you want to take your story elsewhere because you feel like you would need to be compensated more for the amount of work you've put in. I've recently gotten that email from a lovely editor who I'd never worked with before, and who just worked for a small independent publication. So yes, if an editor says, no, why would you ask for more money? Then I don't think they're a real editor, or I just don't think they're working for a legit publication. I don't know.
Wow, that's awesome. So that's just amazing. And I think that's just more, there's a big lesson to be learned there, which is like, honestly, we need to advocate for ourselves always. As your evidence points out, like it literally, more often than not, directly works out to you just being better compensated for your time. So that's awesome, and is also like really encouraging. I think that's a really like it's a surprising amount of success.
Yeah. When you look at the data next to each other, I put the two graphs, how many pitches I get accepted and how many times I ask for more money and I get accepted.
Right.
There's much more green than the one about asking more money.
Yeah. I think that goes in also to what we've known for a while, though, which is like once your foot's in the door and someone's like interested in buying into an idea, you have better leverage to say like, okay, well, now that you're here, let's like make sure things are equitable, or like try to make sure that everyone's being like, getting what they want out of the arrangement. Awesome. Yeah. How do you get assigned by editors? You said you sometimes are just assigned by editor stories versus pitching the story. Is that like you've already worked with someone and they're like, hey, would you also write on this?
Yeah, most of the times it's we've already worked on this other story together. I need somebody to cover this one. Would you jump on it?
Cool.
This involves everything from news stories. So, would you jump on this in the next 3 hours?
Yep.
To longer things like, I want somebody to write this feature. I'm not really sure what this feature would look like. Can you do some work and tell me if you'd be interested in doing this for us?
Mm-hmm.
Other times, I've just been recruited randomly by people who had heard of me or read my work and wanted to
Wow.
add me to the roster of freelancers that they worked with. Sometimes that is just maybe an editor who's moving to a new publication and they're trying to build a new roster. And so they are looking up who's hot and who's doing what. Other times it's like an editor who has heard of me through something else or who is looking for coverage on a certain specific topic that they know I've written about for somebody else. That's a lot less common. Like, it's a lot less common to be randomly headhunted for a story, but let's say like in 2024 it happened like 5 times.
Wow. I love that I like that there's just like multiple ways in which by building on your work, you're like, I guess, just gaining more opportunities as you go. I suppose that's to be expected, but
Yeah. And one thing I also wanted to share is compared to a lot of freelance journalists that you will meet or that you will speak with, or in general in the audience, I am definitely more of a mercenary than many, as in, I fully treat this as a business. I fully treat this as a job. I fully treat this as something working towards my financial goals and increasing that threshold every year and working towards making this sustainable in a way that is very business minded or more business minded than the average. A lot of freelance journalists who I have had the pleasure of working with or speaking with do talk about their work more on a level of just doing enough work to sustain themselves or chasing stories that are really important for them and then finding ways to kind of financially support that. Compared to those very thoughtful, thorough journalists, I am definitely a little bit more on the mercenary side where I often do take work just because I'm making sure that I can pay the bills. And I sometimes chase stories because I know that they make sense. Yeah, they make practical sense, not just big philosophical sense, if that makes sense, which is also why I'm much more of a news reporter than the average freelance science writer, if that makes sense.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just need to fill in for the audience who can't see anything that's happening that Sofia has gone from being under the covers of this blanket to being out of the covers to now wearing the blanket as like a coat sort of or like a shawl. And now it's in a hybrid state as like a head wrap, hood / shawl. And it's just not distracting at all. Jumping forward, but still a little related. What do you think? This could be anything. This could be like a cartoon. This could be like it's a story that your friend tells you just like sitting on a bus. This could be like a poem. What do you think makes for a great story?
I don't know the answer to this.
No, wrong. Failed. Podcast done. Sofia, there are perhaps infinite answers to this, right? It's literally a question of what rings true to your heart. This is like, I'll give you an example. The reason that I fell in love with like science was not like the scientific coursework that I took in school. I mean, I was always like interested, but really it was like watching the Cosmos series that Carl Sagan and Andreon produced in like, was that the 90s? Which if you're unfamiliar, you're probably familiar. If you're unfamiliar, is this incredible, oh my God, really? Oh my God, what are we doing right now? We have to, all right, when you come to North Carolina, we're going to sit and watch this because it's truly remarkable. So this was astronomer, astrophysicist. Anyways, Carl Sagan was formerly a normal scientist, professional scientist. And this series that was later produced by him and his wife, Anne, is like a mini series. It's essentially a bunch of like little documentaries in which they're telling these like amazing sagas of like this is how we understand the distance of planets in the universe, or this is how we came to understand the concept of numbers, or this is how we came to understand that it is the composition of atoms to form molecules and the composition of those molecules to form entities or organisms, that it is the composition and not just like the actual molecules themselves that dictate like what it is, like whether it's an apple or it's a human being or it's a frog. And they would and like honestly for the time it was so superb because like I don't know, dude. He just did like really beautiful, cool experimental shit. And it's like silly and whimsical. And meanwhile, he's like an like 60-year-old gray-haired man in like a turtleneck with like a little blazer on. And he's just very seriously trying to teach people cool science and math while adding fun and silliness and curiosity and wonder. And I cannot believe you have not seen this. Holy shit. Anyways, there's so much cute shit. He once, in the same episode, he says this very famous quote, which you've probably heard, which is, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe, which is to say that we cannot create or destroy matter, right? That's like a law of thermodynamics. Anyways, it's filled with inspirational, pithy shit like that. And my whole point is just like, there's excellence in storytelling there. There's wonder and imagination and beauty and creativity. And I think it is the weirdness and the silliness and the contemporary values in which he would pick these little stories and anecdotes of history and arts to basically teach people how the natural world and the universe works. To me, that is excellence in storytelling. It is using that eclectic nature of reality to like get people interested in something with just like a weird fact or a funny statement. That is excellence in storytelling. What's that element to you? What's an element that stands out that you're like, that I love this story because it's pulled me in because of this?
One thing that I really like in stories and that I would love to see more of is stories that help you question and understand how we know what we know. And that is something I try to infuse in my journalism as well. So just questions about questioning the universe and our perception of it, and how just weird quirks and biases that we've accrued over millennia have fundamentally, radically shifted our perception of the universe and then created new ways. Like the questions that we ask, what informs the questions that we ask about how things happen, and how does that affect the questions that we ask and then the answers that we get, and then it's kind of a vicious cycle. So yes, one element of great storytelling is, I think, the element of interrogating how we know what we know and understanding that that is a fundamental basis of what constructs our understanding of the universe and how we study things, how we learn about things, how we perceive things. I followed a course about the ethics of science a couple years ago, and one really cool professor used to always say that it's the difference between the world that you picture and your picture of the world. So the difference between like the actual ball and then the window through which you're seeing it.
What's like your favorite way to consume media, like just for fun?
A lot of the media I consume is for work, so I'm getting much better about consuming media outside of work just because I enjoy it. That includes reading more fiction that is a little bit experimental, a little quirky, a little silly, rather than reading a lot of nonfiction, which I used to do a lot more of, but kind of still feels like work. And specifically, I like stories infused with magical realism, some gothic stuff. If we've got some girls going around killing people, love that. Carnivorous stuff, love that. Some witchy stuff, love that. So yes, I like that whole corner of the media industry, that whether that's like series or movies or fiction novels that revolve around kind of fantastical, strong, gross, killer women. I used to be a big poetry buff. I was a big Sylvia Plath fan in sadder times of my life. I love electronic music. I love raving. I love going to dubstep concerts. I'm a big drum and bass fan. That's my media consumption for fun, but I don't know if music counts.
Music definitely counts. I mean, I was like a professional musician for a while actually before I like went back into college, because I was told that like if you go to college for science that you can't be a musician because there's no time, which like, God, that's depressing.
Yeah, that's sad.
It's also like not true. But yeah, I remember when I moved to Chapel Hill to go to college, my last show was like at this sick venue in Chapel Hill, which also like paid pretty well, and it was a really fun show. And I cannot remember the last time that I have played live since then, but I have started playing a lot more again at home, and I'm continue to love music. So I think it's a great form of media. It's also like songs or stories. So what gives you hope for the future?
One of the reasons I love doing biodiversity journalism as well, and just nature journalism in general, is kind of the reminder. I think the stories I work on remind readers that, yes, humans are great and they're important and they're special, but they're part of a much, much, much bigger universe with its balance and with its beauty, and the world would be beautiful and fantastic and perfectly functional without us on it as well. And so what gives me hope, or at least what gives me respite, is just that, yeah, the universe is vast and we're just tiny little humans on this small floating rock. And there's a lot of magic and a lot of beautiful networks and crazy evolutionary adaptations in the world around us. And those matter a lot, even if we're so concerned with our tiny day-to-day problems. There's actually a whole vast universe out there, and we're just ants and compared to it. And ants are awesome though, so we're not even as good as ants, to be fair. That's my take. It's not necessarily hopeful as much as it helps, I think, keep me in my place.
This is literally Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot, which is like perhaps one of his
that's
most
what you
famous
talk about all the time.
speeches. And I just dropped the link to that because it's incredible. And that's an excerpt from Cosmos. Again, so incredible. I honestly think that exactly what you said was like the big thing that for me, like watching that show and being like, oh shit, yeah, like each of us individually is like relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of like the universe, which is a little bit of a relief because it's just like, yeah, my problems are ultimately not that big, even if they can feel massive.
Exactly.
That's great. That's a great practical thing for all of us to keep in mind these days, particularly with the gestures vaguely at world.
Particularly with the current state of affairs.
Right. Just all that. I think we actually hit everything, dude, and we're barely over time. So with that, that's a perfect wrap to the first time that we ever did this episode. That brings this story to a close. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and we would love your input. If you have an idea, like a future guest or a new segment, send us a message, podcast@etherealfilms.org, or you can leave us a comment on the Substack. The show is made to help other creatives just like myself, so if you want to support us, tell another friend to start listening. It really makes a difference. Real Perspective is produced in Hillsborough, North Carolina at Ethereal Films. Episodes are co-produced by Ava Richardson-Dodd, and Sammy Bauer is our head of cat wrangling. I'm Eli, and that was A Real Perspective.